Bonjour à tous et bienvenue à ce débat.
Good afternoon to you all and welcome to this online discussion which is to be interesting and exciting. Interpretation is available in English.
Working for us, and really I would like to thank them already from the very beginning for being with us. Donc, nous aurons une conversation avec trois panélistes.
We're going to have a conversation with three highly qualified speakers: Isabelle Durant, Secretary General AI, United Nations Conference on Trade and Development; Jeanine Mbaye is at the Center for Culture and Creative Industry, City University of London; and Gilles Bazelaire, Director, KIKK Festival in Namur. And I am Vincent Defourny, Director of UNESCO's Office in Geneva. Our discussion will be divided into 4 parts, and the last part will enable you to ask questions to the speakers. In the Q&A box, you will be able to ask questions and make comments as you wish. The UN General Assembly declared 2021 International Year of Creative Economy for Sustainable Development in order to draw attention to this sector, which is underestimated and not well known. We have decided to organize this discussion with UNCTAD, our French-speaking Belgian friends, from the Wallonie-Namur region are with us. And we have worked with a whole team to make this discussion available. Isabelle Durant will intervene as a panelist. I am from UNESCO and I'll moderate the discussion. So, and you have Fabienne Retter, General Delegate of Wallonie-Bruxelles in Geneva. She'd like to say a few welcoming words. Thank you, Vincent. You said the most important thing. I just wanted to say a few words to say that Wallonie-Bruxelles is really interested in a creative economy. Its role is essential. It is useful and stimulating in economic and social construction for our future and post-COVID future, and more particularly the future of the youth worldwide. And every player, whatever its size, the type of economy, can contribute. It's not only a domain for large cities. And this is what we wanted to demonstrate, starting from Wallonie, with the presence of Gilles Bazelaire on this panel. And we will have the pleasure to hear about the different perspectives. And this also gave us the opportunity to have a partnership with UNCTAD and UNESCO. It's a pleasure. It's a source of inspiration and enthusiasm. Thank you very much. Thank you to Isabelle Durant, Vincent Defourny, their team, and to my team also, General Delegation Wallonie-Bruxelles in Geneva. I'd like to warmly thank our panelists who accepted to take part in the discussion. There are many of you who got connected, and I'd like to thank you. And we hope that this webinar will give you some clues and that you will be interested in creative economies to rebuild our world and build it back better. Thank you very much, Vincent. Yes, it's actually at the crossroads of arts, culture, digital technologies. The creative economies were impacted by COVID-19, more particularly in the digital area. We would say that there was actually greater exposure and opportunity to see what was possible with the creative features offered by digital technologies. But we know that for many players, event producers, COVID-19 had a terrible impact. Now, the public response to COVID-19 showed that the importance of culture to support resilient communities it has to be stressed. It's important to have such cultural activities, to have creativity in our societies that public authorities in some countries wanted to respond and not to give up this sector of activity. Of course, it was a contrasted intervention depending on the countries, and we're going to discuss that. Now, the UN Secretary General launched in 2020 a challenge to build back better. It's about not going back to the world of before, but building the post-COVID world with a certain number of elements, parameters based on the SDGs. In Geneva International, we do not hear a lot about culture, discussions on culture and creative economy. We're more concerned about issues related to human rights or migrants, refugees, or humanitarian issues. And of course, I don't want to repeat the discussions which took place yesterday between Mr. Biden and Mr. Putin. Now, the interventions of today will give us different perspectives, economic, operational perspectives, which will enable us, thanks to practical issues, what we mean by creative economy. Now, since the contour of creative economy are not quite well established or clear, we would like to start this discussion with Jenny Mbaye. Jenny Mbaye from the Sociology Department of the University City of London. She is the director of the Master Program Culture, Policy and Development. She also teaches at the Center for Creative Economy. And I think that it's the most invited person, and she will introduce what creative economy is about and what is its usefulness. Jenny Mbaye, you have the floor. Thank you, Vincent. Thank you to all the members of your team for the invitation that I accepted with great pleasure. And thank you for your trust to try to present creative economy. I just wanted to recall that creative economy is a sector which is growing fast in a global economy in terms of income generation, in terms of job creation and export income. So it is actually unclear, but it is really interesting. And in order to give you some elements, I'll highlight three aspects. And because we're being invited to build back better with creative economy, this invitation that I'll also repeat here is also related to how to think creative economy better. And I'd like to thank Christopher, who is going to display the first slide of my presentation so that you can follow my presentation. So building back better with creative economy, there are three aspects that I'd like to highlight. The first one, as it was announced earlier, a creative economy comprises all these activities which are interrelated, dependent, and they pertain to the creative capacity of individuals, the capacity to have relations in the area of arts, technology, and trade. And so at the heart of creative economy, we have cultural and creative industries, and they're essential because they are also related to cultural diversity. I'll go back to that later on. It's placed at the level of global market and global cultural world with different histories. And this participation, this cultural participation is enabled through creative economies. And there's something else which is important. The cultural industries fed by creativity, individual talents have a strong potential to create wealth, to create jobs through intellectual property rights. So these are three aspects that I would like to highlight. First, the set of interrelated activities, codependent activities. It's important because it makes it possible for us to take ownership of a concept, ecosystem systems. We have services. We're speaking about intellectual property. And we have this collective interaction. And when you look at this set of interrelated activities, it's important to take into account the space where they take place. So there's a geographic dimension, which is important. It's an economy which is also locally based on territories where creators will have these exchanges on their work, their ideas, and feedback on their work. Now, speaking about this geographic location that will be taken up later on, there's the importance of cities, urban territories. When you speak about a creative economy, this is a recognition which goes through the pivotal role of the local environment. Creative economy is not just floating in air. It is really rooted on values in local cultural organizations. And you can also find links with other elements like intangible cultural heritage, with cultural industries. They're actually mutually reinforcing.
The third feature or dimension that I want to bring out on the creative economy is the major challenge and the specific features of that challenge and the specific political requirements that go with it. In the cultural industry, cultural and creative industry, have an organizational structure that is unusual. We see that there are oligopolies, that is major platforms, Google, Apple, Facebook, Amazon, and many micro enterprises and entrepreneurs. And this constitutes a major challenge for decision makers and policymakers who are more used to handling average size companies. So you have the size challenge and the diversity of actors. And this is also a superstar economy where the winner wins all. You have here the concept of the first one who innovates, the first one who stands out. And here we can think about Cirque du Soleil, who came up with a totally novel concept and basically focuses all of the attention and basically holds all of the interest of the consumers. And then there's something else that's unusual about this economy, because it's a fashion economy that has seasons. And in terms of how it's organized in time, it is very unusual and characteristic. It's also characterized by being project-based. So again, this means something in terms of time organization, because you have teams that are more or less flexible. They can be modulated depending on the type of project. And it's what we can call portfolio careers, where the actors involved can basically have a lot of different activities, jobs, roles. Within a company, people can wear different hats. Jenny, could you tell us what is the difference between the creative economy, the cultural sector? And there's something that could be very useful for the participants to understand exactly what the link is between these different concepts. So there are models to think about the creative economy. And one of the first model was the concentric circles. It was a way to portray the full extent of the creative economy, what we call the basic creative arts that you have in the center. That would be, or that would include literature, publishing, music, performing arts, music. Then the so-called cultural industries. Here you'll have film, museums, galleries, libraries, photography. Then you have cultural and creative industries. So this is yet a bit broader. So you have a little bit more included at this level, because here you find heritage, media, whether it's a broadcasting, radio or television broadcasting, or print. Then finally, it goes on to include video games. And then you have the creative economy as a whole that covers everything where there is intellectual property involved. It goes from art and artists to the text. And here you add design, architecture, fashion, and advertisement. This model, which was used for a long time, puts at the center the creative genius, the individual artist's creative genius. And it's very important to understand the scope of the creative economy. So we had to introduce an additional notion, which is the process of production. And to do so, it required to get away from some kind of hierarchy between innovation and creativity. And basically to look beyond the circles that seemed to imply a hierarchy and would make some activities more marginal. So now we have a notion of cycle, the creative production cycle. So here you have the context of production, and you can see the interdependence and the different links of the production change. You have the actual creation phase, and then you have the various activities that come into play: production, exchange, dissemination, and then consumption and archiving or recording. And it's based on this model that we've come up with the notion of ecosystem. So you have bridges between the different links of the cycle of creative production. And I'm going to show you one more slide that was prepared by Professor Andy Pratt, who's part of our research center. So on this slide, we've populated the production chain. Let me give you an example. The ecosystem in the musical industry. And we see here that there are activities and sub-activities. It's hard to depict it very explicitly, but what we're trying to do is to actually show all the different activities in the production cycle. Well, I would like to have the two other panelists to respond to this. And in particular, I like Gilles Bazelaire to talk about the ecosystem, because you'll be talking about the festival, the KIKK festival. But can you tell us how over the last 10 years, you've seen these ecosystems evolve and the whole universe of the creative economy? Hello to everybody, and thank you for throwing at me a question that's not easy at all. I don't study creative industry, but I work in it. So it's not always easy to answer such a question. I see an evolution in several ways. I'm more in digital creativity, which is part of the cultural and creative industry. Not everything is digital, but that is more specifically where I work. And as we saw in Jenny's slide, the cultural and creative industry is sort of broken up. When we first started talking about, first of all, industry was kind of a bad word, and it was much more in silos. And now what we're seeing is creativity is exploding in this industry, is giving birth to micro trainings, micro jobs, all kinds of projects, and many capacities, and in the performance arena in particular. So the industry is very broken up and very scattered. It's all over the place in a way. And the more you have it broken up in this, the harder it is for it to unite and to speak with one voice, because you're sort of in the school of sardines. So you're swimming along with many other sardines, and they can come together to make a project, for instance, for a given production. Let me take a major with Cirque du Soleil. What does Cirque du Soleil do? When they bring a project together, they will go and get all kinds of little fish or sardines out there for very specific skill sets to come up with the best possible performance. They come together and they travel a bit together, and then they separate again. And over the last 10 years, I think that was the most significant change in evolution that I've seen. So if you just take it at the level of my company, because I'm also an entrepreneur, first of all, we integrated all kinds of skills, or we imported skills internally. Now what we do, we bring in the skills that are more soft skills, the ability to integrate many different talents on a given project. And it means that our projects are more creative, are more powerful. And then we can go back to our core group, and then we can grow and deploy again. And so we're not doing the same thing over and over again. And that is definitely one of our characteristics, is this desire to constantly change and evolve. That's exactly the challenge of the creative industry. And I imagine that for UNCTAD, and here I'm turning to Isabelle Durant, supporting the creative industry must truly be a challenge. Isabelle? So if you put culture and cultural activities in the huge basket of commercial activities, can culture be considered as an economic good just as any other economic good or product? Is true at UNCTAD. We look at the creative economy through the other angle, not just the fish that are coming together, but we look at how they're remunerated, how they come together to form the sardine industry, if I could use such a term, and to what extent there's a benefit or an economic return for an entity, and that entity could be a country or region, and not just the community of viewers or spectators. So that's the way we tend to view it. And as Jenny said very correctly, this is a sector that's so fluid and constantly changing that it's hard to quantify it. But it's not the only sector in which measurement is difficult. If you want to measure illegal financial flows, very difficult because by definition they're hard to measure. And measuring the benefit of the digital economy is also equally difficult. So culture is not the only sector that is so hard to quantify or to define. It's very characteristic in what it provides to human societies and is tied in with a local area. But like many other areas, it's increasingly difficult to pinpoint. And we look at it, of course, under many perspectives, but especially from the perspective of development is not just the economic benefit for each one of the actors. Does it serve the overall interest of development? And Vincent, you saw during the pandemic, some sectors, and particularly those who had a technological aspect, simply exploded with some very interesting results, but also with a great deal of injustices and very poor distribution. And which brings me to the last thing that we want to work on. The intellectual property rights are far from simple because how do you remunerate the small, the medium, and the large sardines? Very complicated because the intellectual property rights are under national law, but there's constantly moving and flowing exchanges. So all of the issues related to international intellectual rights are it's very difficult. So regardless of the cultural value of the product, there has to be fair remuneration for the creator, for the producer, for the distributor. And today, pirating is ubiquitous, and so many things simply escape quantification. So they're one of the challenges to compile data, which is not easy to do. It'd be really great to have a great data bank in the sky, but this is an area in the sort of post-COVID phase has a lot of potential. And you know, when I talk about post-COVID, I'm talking about building back better. So here we have tremendous potential. I think when I see the other people, the people I work with on the development side, they're looking primarily to economic recovery through more classical means. And I don't think that they are thinking in terms of the creative industry.
We will go back to the challenge of building back better, but I'd like to go back to Jenny. Isabelle, you mentioned some major trends and challenges related to remuneration of cultural entrepreneurs and all the players in this industry. But maybe there are other dimensions, challenges that Jenny would like to maybe highlight to maybe conclude that general introduction on creative economy. I just wanted first to recall that this is quite a challenge, and it is expressed through different fields and different sectors in the digital area, for instance. There is a question you put to Isabelle. Now, I'd like to say that this is not a product like others. It is rather extraordinary because you have this identity, dimension, value, dimension, meaning, a full dimension, and the policies which is important for well-being, social well-being, cohesion, and so on, but also a representation, a humanistic vision of this economic field, which has to be recalled here. When I mentioned an ecosystem, it's a way of saying that smaller fish as well as bigger fish are mingling together. There are different sectors, formal, informal sector, commercial, not commercial, subsidized by the state, not subsidized by the state, profit-making, not for profit-making, mainstream, independent. So when you look at this ecosystem, you can see the interrelatedness of all these activities. So you can think about creative economy, trying to rank what is formal, what is not formal, and so on. But what is interesting is this integration of all these different type of activities with their different profiles, which are interrelated. Thank you, Jenny. So this was the first part of our webinar. We didn't go around all the aspects of creative economy, but we're starting to see things clearer. Now I'd like to move on to the second part of our discussions. I'm asking the following question: how can creative economy serve as a lever to rebuild better, to contribute more particularly to the SDG? Now, Isabelle Durant, as the UNCTAD Secretary General, AI, with different economic actors, you're trying to maybe give a direction to creative economy together with all other types of economies. Isabelle, you have the floor. I think that creative economy must be taken into account in building back better. The difficulty is that in this highly complicated period we're experiencing, we want to actually avoid breaking up the ecosystem, which has just been described. That is, finding one angle which looks like a more cost-effective in the short term, neglecting others. Now, this is a state of mind. Even before I arrived at UNCTAD, it's not always well understood in the economic world. Now, just a parenthesis, we actually invited Mrs. Esther Duflo, Nobel Prize for Economy. She actually asking for revising their provisions, forecast, back and forth, and so on. And this kind of analysis leads to a lot of thinking. It's not easy, more particularly for a country which is faced with difficulties with the pandemic, which has a huge socioeconomic effects. It's not easy to actually define their actions. We've seen even in Europe how culture was forgotten. I don't want to judge what was done and was right and what was not done. And I know that actors in the cultural economy were left aside, and they really suffered for that. And people need culture as much as bread. It's not easy today to convince people that creative economy is an activity which is very important. When you're speaking to people who are thinking about basic commodities, facing difficult situations, so this system, which is really rather vague, combining human aspects, investment aspects for people who were really left aside, during this period and even before, because actually what is said, and it is true, is that COVID-19 really exacerbated difficulties which existed before. So seeing the creative economy as one major actor, and maybe the International Year can help for that. Indonesia, for instance, they really want to work on creative economy because they turn it into a major lever. Others use the more traditional levers for development. Now we have a small team at UNCTAD working on this, but we don't need to have a large number of people to come up with interesting initiatives. So using creative economy as one of the levers, not the only one, but one of the levers, linking up with technological aspects, because digital technology, our member states, they understand that better, e-commerce, buying, selling, and so on. So e-commerce somehow on some aspect has nothing to do with creative economy, but sometimes it's easier to use that as a point of entry rather than using an approach people are not familiar with, and they're not really sensitive to what we are saying, while they are trying to find immediate solutions. I'd like to pick this up with Mbaye. Public policies. How can creative economy be developed? What could be the main actions that states can undertake in order to develop creative economy? First comment should start with what exists rather than what should be. Sometimes it's the trap when you idealize and when you approach creative economy, importing policies which were implemented elsewhere, initiatives implemented elsewhere. The thing is to understand that creative economy draws its strength from the local level. What are the assets, the weaknesses, the opportunities which exist in a territory specific to that territory? It's the first step in mapping the ecosystem, mapping the ecosystem. What exists? What are the strengths, the weaknesses, and also when you use the matrix that I showed on the slide with the different steps of the production cycle, we can try to see whether it's at the level of creation that we have our strong points. Do we have training? Because we speak about the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. Culture is explicitly mentioned in number 11, but in number 4, education, it's also present. Do we have education systems, creators, distributors, producers involved at all these levels, disseminating? Do we have initiatives at those levels? This is what makes it possible to know where we are starting from. So we really need that as a first step. Be locally based and use what is present at local level. Just wanted to add, if you allow me, Vincent, the local mapping is essential to see what you're starting, where you're starting from. But at the same time, you realize that in creative economy, the value added of cultural products, even when they come from the country, the value added happens elsewhere. The studios sometimes are elsewhere in specialized areas. Now, for developing countries or less specialized countries, there is a very good basic material, you have the mapping at a time when it can become profitable, or it has to be produced in a certain way. Well, it is taken elsewhere. Why? Because the regulatory framework is not there, the material is not there, the studio is not there. So it's just like basic commodities. You have cocoa beans, but the good chocolate is produced elsewhere. So the value added between the cocoa bean and the product, final product which is sold, does not go to the country where the cocoa beans were produced. So if you want a rooted, locally rooted product, it has to also be profitable at the local level, not only a very good cultural product and so on, but also something that has a value at economic level. So the local presence leads me to turn to Gilles Bazelaire, International Festival from Namur, a small city, and yet you were able to create an international festival. So could you actually explain to us what it means to be locally based, and how did you proceed? This is something that is really interesting for me. There is this thread all through with all the projects that we created ever since the beginning. One of the first clients said, well, it's very good, it's highly creative, but you were not born at the right place. Maybe at that time, I didn't realize it, but I was really disrupted, you know, by that, to see that we had to go to a big capital to be able to do what we were interested in, and get more development. So we decided to do the opposite. It is true that what Mrs. Durant said, the economic value, and we should not neglect to mention that, is mainly in the Anglo-Saxon countries, but you have a very good potential in Europe, in countries of the South, or in Namur, yes, or in Namur, and the capital of Wallonie. So this a very rich potential, and we can simplify and use what was done at the time of mining and the development of other industries, where the processing took place elsewhere and the value added took place elsewhere, as Mrs. Durant said. But it is changing fast, and the festival that we created in Namur, and the track, the hub that was set up in Namur, other projects, well, are being developed from our small size territory, 100,000 inhabitants. It is possible when it is recognized, when there are people who are also working for it, because the industry is using all these possibilities, all this potential. And it is possible to create, as we have shown for the past 10 years, a festival attracting people from 55 countries, people coming from the Anglo-Saxon world to our country, from the east, from the west. And so there is a kind of convergence in this small city of Namur. During 4 days, there is a whole series of players of creative industries who gather.
There's not one reason, there's 1,000 reasons. And one of the main reasons is that we decided to do it exactly where we live. And there were several actors who heard us. We were recognized as creators, and venues were built. And even if we're in a small town like Namur, right from the beginning, we wanted this to have an international flavor or scope. And there's nothing contradictory in saying that you do a local project where you live while maintaining a very strong connection with the international scene. In fact, that's essential. And these different factors, these different actors, this is what made it possible to start by creating a company and a whole ecosystem around the festival, a place in which creative enterprises are growing, and a space where people are coming for training and to discover what we're doing. If I could just finish with something, I'd like to stress something. It's not something that we imagined this way in the beginning. It wasn't, in fact, our role as people who are working locally. We were sort of, feeling our way through it. We were not studying or looking at what we were doing. We were just doing it. But 10 years later, looking back, we realized it's because we were local that we were able to create the different pieces of the puzzle that really fit in with what was needed at the local level. So if I'm reading you correctly or understanding you correctly, the festival, in a way, did a kind of mapping, but it did it in a very empirical way. Networking, bringing together different actors of the creative economy, in particular on the digital side, although not only on the digital side. And you basically are creating a dynamic that makes it possible to go even further. And if you're still at it 10 years later and you're growing year by year, it means that there's a demand for it, an appetite for it, and that everybody's interest is met. So what kind of feedback do you get? How can you measure? How can you really know what the real level of attention is? Actually, it's quite difficult to measure it. As I said, our industry is by definition very difficult to measure. It's very complex, it's very diversified. What we do see is it just getting bigger. First, it was a festival that brought together designers, creative coders. That was really our field of activity. Then over time, we realized that we could open up, we could basically disseminate and our content to a broader profile. And the event could become broader, it could have more value. And so in this way, we could sell tickets and to a broader audience. So rather than having 4 sides to our festival, so to speak, it became multifaceted. So there were different ways in which a visitor could sort of enter into the festival. So, a given visitor would come for a given reason. They were interested in something specific, but then they would go on to discover something else. So maybe I would come into this festival for a specific type of content, and simply by virtue of being there, I would discover a night type of content, and I would take an interest in this, and this leads me on to a different idea, a different concept, a different encounter. And that's something that really, really worked to make possible in the festival. So the number and the type of content is proposed, so it's as diverse as possible. And also things are sort of interconnected. You can flow from one event or one profile to another. And an actor in the creative industry is somebody who's a critic in the positive meaning of the word, and who takes a different view of the world. And that's one of the important values of the festival. We're not locked into, say, a strictly techno festival, but basically it's all about the critical view of the creator. And so the creator who comes into contact with other people, as happens in in a festival. This is a source of a new value of innovation. And again, this is not something that we had foreseen right from the beginning, but we have seen it happen over time. And as the event has grown, we see that it's become richer, and it's basically generated and produced all kinds of value. Isabelle and Durant, as you hear this way of describing the festival in Namur, would that urge you to tell other member states or other regions or cities to go ahead and do something like this? Is this something that can stimulate basically a kind of a dialogue between decision makers and other actors in the sector? As was explained very well, this is not something that was designed top down. It was grassroots up, and then things sort of came together. What is difficult, and this is not something that the UNCTAD can do, is to know within a community, a region, or a country, and never mind whether it's a developed or not country or not. So what's hard is to know or identify the actors who can work together, who could come together, who are dynamic, or who might generate an interesting dynamic, and in such a way to get support from public authorities to create a festival in a place that nobody knows. And I'm not saying that nobody knows Namur, but in a country or in a town or a region that's simply not well known. Actually, I'd like to give you an example that I was struck by. So it's a more conventional festival, so it's less innovative than this is the Armani festival that was set up by a Belgian national in the Kivu in the Congo. It's a music festival, so that's a classical. This is not a creative ecosystem, but it's a place, a venue where nobody would imagine that you would do a music festival in Bukavu, because actually bringing people together, equipment and musicians, and everybody knows what African music is, but still organizing that type of an event, it was a huge challenge. I think, unfortunately, the creator of the festival has died, but it was a beautiful experience and it took place several times. So it's possible if you can bring people together starting at the grassroots level, but then, the public authorities have to be there and be supportive. But you need people who are going to be the leaders, the instigators, and there are such people, everybody, but they don't always have a very enabling environment. There are such creators everywhere. And I'd like to go back to Jenny on the whole issue of identity. We talked about the role of the creative industry in that contributes to building an identity. If you take, for instance, the festival in Kivu that probably developed because it was an echo to expectations. There was a real need, and it was probably completely in phase with the local population. So how do you see this sort of this gelling role of culture to bring together the creative industry in a given sector? I see two aspects. Well, we could talk a lot with UNESCO with the 2005 Convention on the promotion and the protection of the diversity of cultural expression. So speaking in plain words, is the business of culture. And we talked earlier about intangible cultural heritage. And how does this feed and how do the various areas of UNESCO sort of work with one another? how can we see culture in a broader sense? And we see that within a social group, a connection is established and nourished. It's very nurturing. I really like the example that Gilles shared with us. There's an idea that was born and that evolves, grows, and we see how the creative industry gives new life to production, to service, to trade, to entertainment. It changes the environment in which people work, in which people live and work, and how people think of themselves and reinvent themselves. So that's in a systemic way, but now in a more local way and in link with the political process. Yes, it starts at the grassroots level. And then what's the role of authorities or deciders in this broader vision of the creative industry? Sometimes there's a more limited vision, or rather, I should say, a vision that's not sufficiently holistic of that economy. So what's at stake here is to re-educate public authorities so that they can better understand this economy. So they can, there needs to be a better understanding to see all these different responsibilities, because of course there's the citizens on the one hand who are fascinated and who want to be entrepreneurs, but what's the responsibility of the support, short-term, medium-term, long-term? And sometimes just giving out a subsidy makes people perfectly content. But basically, the public authorities also need to have a way to understand how it all works. And one last thing, I talked about ecosystems, and there's a very useful concept. It's the global production network. And it's exactly what Gilles was saying with his example. You can start with something that's completely local, but it's not because you're starting locally that you're not connected. And through this vision of an ecosystem, you can see where are the challenges, where are the challenges in terms of environmental conditions for production. These are not mutually exclusive. Gilles, you talked about the impact of the KIKK Festival on the town of Namur and the gradual involvement of the local population in the festival. Can you tell us more about this? And tell us a little bit about how the local authorities changed their way of seeing the festival.
I think this is in line with what Jenny just said. I am highly respectful of public authorities in general, of policies. I think it's a complicated profession. There is something that should not be forgotten. It's to be able to ask questions and to renew oneself. At the beginning in Namur, people didn't understand. I should say it honestly. There were 500 people, and there was a kind of build-up, and we said, well, there's nothing in Belgium for our ecosystem, let's do it. And there's a local player who said, well, I'll support you. So we very quickly had public authorities and Namur inhabitants interested. They said, it's not for us, but it looks good. So they seem to be doing things as it should. They seem to be doing this properly. So let's support them. So we had people coming over the years. In Namur, you could hear Chinese, Mexican, Spanish, English, and so on. So there was a kind of mix in our event. And then we also took some time to think and said, well, when you create an event which is growing, which has an economic impact, which is gathering people, well, you also need to turn towards empowerment, increasing the knowledge of the world in which it is created. So we started thinking, we work with public authorities. It's not simple because players in the creative industry world, and this is a reproach that I make to the creative economy world, because we don't take time to explain to how we work, why we act this way and not that way to people who are not part of this world. So we took time, we listened to people, we gave them some space, and we decided to open up the festival to the town. And we created a project which is called KIKK in Town. It is distributed in about 30 locations. There was a huge tent in a central square in Namur, and we invited inhabitants in Namur to come. We said it's not only for the international public, but also for you. There was a whole series of contents that people are interested, humans are interested in that. So we actually invited the local audience to come, and they came to discover the market, the KIKK in Town in different locations. And we realized that over the years, people were starting to understand the digital art, startup projects in our market. And then Liège and Charleroi and Brussels also at one point in time came, but most of the time, well, they don't go to Namur when they live in Brussels. They don't come to Namur. And then we got also Flemish people who came, and people from neighboring countries coming to spend 2 days in Namur for this event. So we can see that the overall understanding of the challenges and what is our stakes, what is at stake in our sector after 5 years, there was a huge development. So this opening that we did initially, just by wondering why we can't do this without being connected with the local people in Namur, we thought it was stupid not to open up to the local people. And we're really proud of this, because we can see that the territory is growing with this, with our industry, with other sectors also growing, and that is important. We have several questions in the Q&A, and I'll try to summarize some of them. There is one, I think, directed to Isabelle, but maybe to others also. It is related to the interrelations between the development of cultural policy and employment, social security issues. And the other question behind that is, isn't it necessary to strengthen the dialogue between people who are in charge of employment issues and people who are in the area of culture? Yes, of course, yes. We know it. In Belgium, we have the status of the artist, the social status of creators, because, well, they need to live, they need to provide for their families, to have a decent life, and they're not all able to do so. Far from that. So I think that these two worlds have to speak to each other. They don't always understand each other. Some people don't understand what an artist is. There are different types of artists. It's not easy to define an artist. It's not someone who has long hair, who doesn't sleep at night. So you have the artistic creation, which takes several forms, more particularly in the digital world. So this is the reason why I think that the issue of digital technology and culture, it's interesting because these are worlds which cross each other, and at the same time they have their specificities. And little by little, public authorities are now understanding the fact that they need to have a cross-cutting approach. This is not the reason why we're going to have a good protection for artists and a good status for artists. I also respect the political world, the administration world, those who are in charge of the public good, but we have to understand what are the constraints they are faced with. It's not easy with the existing regulations to move from something which is vertically organized to something which is more horizontally organized, and to have something which is more fluid, which is more flexible portability when you move from one status to another. That is for developed countries when they have a well-built social security, and they have to be adapted to the new system. But let us not forget that in the majority of countries, you don't have social protection. Social protection is based on social solidarity, solidarity within the family, and so on. So this is a different model. So we are, in that case, trying to build a basic social protection, and we were able to see how the youth, the women really paid a heavy toll when they were hard hit when things stopped. So you have the informal sector, but it's not as informal as that. In the informal sector, you also have a formal side because people know how it works, but it is not taken into account in the conventional administrative organization and calculations. There's just an estimate which is made from the economic point of view. And sometimes the informal sector is also well organized. Yes, informal is really real. We also have a comment from a person mentioning a project. If I understood it clearly, it's a project, creative approach with technological platforms. And the question that that person is asking is, what recommendation can you make to someone who would like to develop a creative project along those lines? Well, I have my idea on behalf of UNESCO, but I'd like to let you react to that. Isabelle, Jenny, do you have Gilles? Gilles, maybe is the person to answer. Well, I think this is a question for UNESCO. It's impossible to answer without knowing what is the exact project. As I said earlier on, I think if I can give an advice at my age, don't do it alone. All the projects that we developed here, we did not do it on our own. We tried to find the right person to support us. So this is the advice, the piece of advice that I can give. What I wanted to say on behalf of UNESCO, UNESCO does not provide subsidies to activities. We don't give money, but there is an international fund for cultural diversity. And you have small-scale projects which sometimes can get some seed money to develop ideas, but certainly not to fully develop a project. So for the person who asked the question, the good piece of advice to give is not to develop it on one's own, not to go on one's own, as Gilles Bazelaire said, find partners. So I can see that time is flying. It's 11 minutes past 5, and we have to move on to the conclusion of our webinar, of our discussions. First of all, I'd like to thank you for your very rich, diversified, interesting contributions, which were really interesting to hear. As you said, creativity is more and more recognized as a resource, a renewable energy, present all the time through the world, and which takes part in development. When you think about that, it is extraordinary. Renewable energy always present, which is related to everything and which can lead to sustainable development. And we also know that a creative economy which is based on freedom of expression, we did not discuss this aspect, but it's important to highlight it, freedom of expression and cultural rights. This can also boost inclusive societies, more tolerant, peaceful societies. It's an economy which can also strengthen the autonomy and the engagement of several vulnerable groups which are marginalized in their own societies. UNESCO, with the UN partners, UNCTAD, would like to highlight the cross-cutting role of culture in achieving the Sustainable Development Goal, consolidate international cooperation for the support of creative economy is one priority. There are activities like the Forum of Ministries of Culture, the online meeting of Ministers of Culture. At the beginning of the pandemics, we organized an exceptional meeting of Ministers of Culture, and we were wondering how to support this sector. And how can we also provide support to the different players in the creative economy? Integrating culture is also an interesting element in the G20 process. And I think that UNCTAD, in its 15th session in October, will also discuss these aspects of creative economy, because it's going to be a way of celebrating the International Year of Creative Economy for Sustainable Development. So integrating culture and creative economy in the public societies for resilient and sustainable economies is also part of the things we're interested in. But there's so many actors, players that we need concerted efforts. All member states cannot be on the same at the same level, but we want to support creative economy from the basis, from the grassroots.
Donc, I'm sorry, it's really the need to work from the ground up to achieve a more international level and a more sustainable dimension for the whole sector. And finally, COVID has basically shown up some vulnerabilities that were probably pre-existent, but just became more apparent. And the shared experiences and everything that characterizes culture, I mean, it's been very hard hit, and many small companies simply don't have any cash flow or don't have any endowments. They are fighting to survive. And this is something that we must emphasize. We can't even begin to talk about this sector without bringing that up. In this sector, many of these part-time workers or self-employed are not, can even aspire to any benefits. So they're in situations that are made that much more difficult. And yet, the pandemic, as we were just saying, has clearly shown how important the creative economy is for the collective well-being of society. And I think that's one of the most interesting things to have come out of this very unique time and period that we've gone through. So speaking, of course, from the standpoint of UNESCO, but you also said it, to inspire decision makers and public policy. First of all, to look at the status of artists and professional creators. So artists and professionals in the sector have to have dignified working conditions, because the member states are encouraged to review the policies regarding the status of artists, the equitable and fair remuneration of work both online and offline. And then secondly, to create an environment that's enabling for sustainable policies. We talked about this with Namur. It is necessary to create an environment that's enabling for creative and artistic professions. And here it has to be linked in with jobs policies and with measures. And this presupposes that we know how to measure creative industries and how they develop. And the third topic, and I don't want to expand on this because it's almost a whole nother debate, but the third axis that we need to think about if we want to support public policies for creative industry is how to adapt cultural policies and the support to creative industry to the digital transformation challenge, because the digital transformation is something that's occurring throughout all sectors, but that alone would deserve another debate. I think I'll leave it at that. I'd like to thank all of you for having participated, the three panelists, all of the teams that took part in the organization of this webinar, and all the participants who came online. I saw that we had a participant from the Philippines, so our very warm greetings to the Philippines and to all other people wherever they are in the world. And this is one of the virtues of the digital connection, because we are connected across the world. So I wish you a very fine day, end of day for those who are ending their day, or beginning of the day for those who are just starting out, and I hope to see you again soon. Goodbye.